All right, so today we're getting philosophical. We're diving into some deep questions, questions people have been asking for a long time, questions about art.
Yeah, exactly. What is it about art that grabs us?
Yeah.
What makes a painting or a poem or a play stick with us? What makes it good, even? These questions, they've been on people's minds for millennia.
And we're going way back to ancient Greece to try and get some answers. Specifically, we're looking at Aristotle and what he had to say about art.
Aristotle. Now there's a thinker who really got how deeply art connects with us humans.
Right. And he wasn't just like a philosopher in an ivory tower. We're talking about Athens in its heyday. Art was a vibrant part of public life.
hmm
Tragedies, comedies, all performed as part of these big festivals.
Exactly. And for Aristotle, the most interesting art forms, the ones he really digs into, are poetry, tragedy, and comedy. He wrote a whole treatise on it, the Poetics, and it's still hugely influential today.
I mean, it's amazing to think that this guy over 2,000 years ago is still shaping how we understand art.
It really is. And we'll also be looking at fragments of some of his other works, like on poets and Homeric problems, to get a fuller picture of his thinking. Fill in some gaps.
So it sounds like a pretty deep dive. Are you ready for this?
Absolutely. Let's jump in.
All right, let's start with the basics. Why poetry? Why did Aristotle focus so heavily on that?
Well, for Aristotle, poetry was more than just rhyming words. It was about representation. It was about bringing stories and characters to life. And in ancient Greece, especially in Athens, poetry was a huge deal. It was public, it was performative, and it was powerful.
So those big dramatic performances during the festivals, that's what he had in mind.
Exactly. You have to remember, these weren't just entertainment. They were woven into the fabric of Athenian life. Religious significance, civic pride, you name it. It was a way to explore big ideas about what it means to be human, to face challenges, to celebrate.
Okay, but why tragedy and comedy specifically?
It seems Aristotle saw them as the most developed forms of poetry in his time. I mean, they were fully enacted. Music, costumes, the whole shebang. And they dealt with these really intense, universal human experiences, joy, sorrow, loss, triumph, the stuff that makes us who we are.
Makes sense. Now, you mentioned representation. That's where this idea of mimesis comes in, right?
Yeah, mimesis. It's a core concept for Aristotle, for his whole understanding of art. It's not just about mimicking reality, though. It's deeper than that. He sees it on two levels.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Two levels.
Yeah. So there's the pictorial aspect,
hmm
basically recognizing resemblance. Think of like looking at a portrait and immediately knowing who it is.
Yeah.
That's mimesis at work.
Right, so making a connection between the image and the real thing.
Exactly. But then there's this other level, the dynamic aspect.
hmm
This is about bringing something to life, enacting it, like an actor embodying a character on stage. It's not just a static image anymore. It's a performance, an experience.
I can see how that would have been really powerful in those ancient Greek theaters. So how does this mimesis thing play out in poetry specifically?
Well, for Aristotle, mimesis is what separates poetry from just writing verses. He even uses this example comparing Empedocles, a philosopher who wrote in verse, to Homer,
Homer, as in the Odyssey, the Iliad.
the one and only. See, Aristotle says both used meter, both wrote in verse. But only Homer was really doing mimesis. He created characters, stories, worlds that came alive through his words. It's the representation, the mimesis, that makes it poetry for Aristotle, not just the rhyme or the rhythm.
So just because you're writing in verse, it doesn't automatically make you a poet in Aristotle's book.
Nope, not at all. He actually pushes this idea even further in some fragments from On Poets. He even talks about prose dialogues, like early philosophical debates, as forms of mimesis.
Wait, prose. So he's saying those philosophical dialogues could also be considered a kind of poetry, even though they're not written in verse.
Yeah. He was maybe even taking a little jab at Plato with this, because Plato was famously critical of mimetic poetry, but he wrote those supercrafted dialogues himself, dialogues full of characters and stories. So Aristotle seems to be saying, hey, it's all mimesis in the end.
Haha. Philosophers throwing shade, even back then.
It's all about the representation of complete actions, the things people do, the choices they make. That's the core of poetry for Aristotle.
Okay, that's super interesting. Now, you mentioned On Poets. I know that book isn't complete, just fragments, but it seems like it was all about judging poetry, right? What makes a poem good or bad?
It does seem that way. Poets was very concerned with identifying the shortcomings of poets, as he puts it in the Poetics.
Shortcomings, like what kind of mistakes did poets make?
Well, there's this really interesting example from later on, a writer named Macrobius. He actually quotes Aristotle criticizing Euripides, the playwright.
Euripides, he was a big name, right? One of the great tragedians.
Yeah, absolutely. But apparently, Euripides made this mistake in one of his plays. He depicted Aetolian warriors, these fierce fighters, going into battle without sandals on their left foot.
Hmm, okay.
But historically, they fought without sandals on their right foot.
Seriously, that's what Aristotle was criticizing. Seems kind of nitpicky, doesn't it?
It does, right? But for Aristotle, it's not just about getting the facts right. It's about maintaining the illusion, the world the poet has created. He felt that these kinds of errors, even small ones, could take the audience out of the story. They might notice it, and suddenly it's not a tragedy anymore, it's almost comical.
Ah, so he's thinking about the audience's experience, how these little details can impact how they feel and understand the play.
Exactly. It's not just about pedantry. It's about the overall artistic effect.
So is this where we start to see the roots of what we now call literary criticism? People actually analyzing and evaluating art, not just enjoying it passively.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's this other writer, Dio Chrysostom. He even says Aristotle was at the origin of literary criticism, kritike in Greek. It's the idea that educated people shouldn't just accept poetry blindly. They should be able to judge its quality, its strengths, and weaknesses. And that's a big shift from how things were before, with those rhapsodes just reciting Homer without really understanding it deeply.
Right. So On Poets is all about judging poetry. Now, what about Homeric problems? The title itself suggests some controversy surrounding Homer, right?
Yeah, you could say that. I mean, Homer was the poet in ancient Greece, almost a godlike status. But, of course, not everyone loved everything he wrote. Some philosophers, like Xenophanes and Heraclitus, they had problems with how Homer portrayed the gods, acting all too human.
And didn't Plato have a whole thing about Homer? Something about his morals?
Yeah, he was worried that people would take Homer's stories literally and start behaving like the gods and heroes who weren't always the best role models.
So how did Aristotle address these criticisms of Homer? Did he try to interpret the stories allegorically or something?
Interestingly, no. His approach in Homeric problems is actually quite different. He defends Homer, but not by saying, oh, there's a hidden moral message here, or it's all just symbolic. He defends Homer on artistic grounds.
What do you mean artistic
He's
grounds?
basically saying, look, we should judge poetry based on its own aims and principles. It's an art form. It's not politics, it's not ethics, it has its own rules.
Judge it as art, not as a moral instruction manual.
Right. He even says this explicitly in the Poetics. It's not the same criterion of correctness that applies in poetry and in politics, or any other art form for that matter.
I'm guessing he had some specific examples of how this works in practice.
Oh, absolutely. So take the portrayal of the gods. Critics were like, these gods are behaving badly, it's a scandal. But Aristotle says, hold on. Poets have to work with how people actually understand the gods. If you make them too perfect, too distant, the stories won't resonate with the audience. It's about creating a world that makes sense, even if it's not perfectly aligned with some abstract moral code.
So artistic effectiveness sometimes trumps strict morality.
You got it. Another example. He talks about the scene in the Iliad where Achilles is chasing Hector. Achilles just nods, and all the other soldiers back off, letting them fight one-on-one. Now, that's not very realistic, right? People don't just obey a nod like that. But Aristotle says, look, it creates this sense of wonder, this awe. And that's a legitimate effect that poetry can aim for.
So even if it's a little unrealistic, it serves a greater artistic purpose.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just about defending Homer either. He uses this same kind of logic to talk about tragedy and the poetics. He has this example of Euripides' character, Menelaus. He's considered kind of cowardly.
Not a very heroic trait.
Yeah. And Aristotle's not happy about it. But not because it's unethical. He's concerned that a cowardly character undermines the tragic effect. You can't really feel pity and fear for someone who's just acting basely.
Makes sense. The audience needs to be invested in the character's fate.
Right. He even compares it to painting a horse with two right legs extended forward. It's not anatomically correct, but it might make the horse look like it's galloping, creating a stronger impression of movement.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together. It's not about sticking to the literal facts or some moral checklist. It's about creating an experience that works on an artistic level.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the poetics itself. You could say it's the culmination of all these ideas.
So we've got On Poets, which is about judging poetry, Homeric Problems, which is about defending poetry. What's the main goal of the Poetics?
Well, on the surface, it might seem like a how-to guide for writing tragedies. Lots of rules and guidelines. But I think it's actually more about understanding the nature of poetry, specifically tragedy. It's about revealing the inner workings, the principles that make a tragedy successful.
So not necessarily a manual, but a way to understand why some plays work better than others.
Exactly. He even acknowledges that poetic skill is partly a matter of natural talent. He says, the art of poetic composition belongs to a naturally gifted man.
So even if you read the Poetics cover to cover, you're not guaranteed to become the next Sophocles.
Right. It's more about explaining the why behind things. Why does this plot twist work? Why is this character believable? It's about developing a deeper understanding, a critical appreciation. Just like philosophers want to understand the why of the universe.
Okay, I like that. So what are some of the big ideas Aristotle explores in the Poetics?
Well, he's very interested in the telos, the end goal, and the ergon, the function of tragedy. What is it supposed to do? And he's looking for the best tragedy, the one that fulfills its purpose most effectively.
And what is the purpose of tragedy, according to Aristotle?
He actually lays this out right at the beginning. He wants to examine the essence of poetry, its different forms, its dunamis, its power or effect, the construction of plots, the components of a tragedy, all of that.
So it's not just about what's happening in the play, it's about the effect it has on the audience.
Right. And Aristotle, like Homer, he sees pleasure as the ultimate aim of poetry. A good tragedy is one that gives its audience a particular kind of pleasure. And then he goes on to analyze exactly how tragedy does that.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've talked about Mimesis, we've talked about judging poetry, defending Homer, but what does Aristotle actually say about what poetry is? What makes it unique?
Well, he's very interested in how poetry came to be, its natural origins. He actually says that it springs from two basic human instincts. First, the instinct for mimesis, the pleasure we get from experiencing representations. And second, the instinct for melody and rhythm.
So we're naturally drawn to both representation and music.
Exactly. And he contrasts this with Plato's idea that poets are divinely inspired. Aristotle says, no, it's a natural talent. Some people are just good at it.
And how does this natural talent lead to the different genres of poetry?
He initially suggests it's based on the poet's temperament. Serious-minded poets will create tragedies, lighter poets will create comedies, but then he sort of refines this idea. He points to Homer, who could do both. So maybe it's not so much about the poet themselves, but the kind of story they choose to tell.
So it's not a moral judgment. A good poet can write both tragedy and comedy.
Exactly. The choice to represent characters as better or worse than average depends on what the genre demands. Tragedy needs characters whose downfall will evoke pity and fear, while comedy needs characters whose flaws and blunders will make us laugh.
Right. It makes sense that different genres will have different aims.
And speaking of aims, remember that idea of pleasure we talked about? The pleasure of experiencing mimesis? Aristotle actually tackles this head-on.
This is where he talks about the ugly animal, right?
Yep. He uses that example to explain why we can find pleasure in representations of things that would disgust us in real life. Like, imagine a really gross bug. Seeing it up close would be awful, but seeing a realistic painting of it can be enjoyable.
Okay, but why? Why would we enjoy that?
Because, he says, we take pleasure in the act of recognition. We recognize it as a representation of that bug, and that act of understanding, of making that connection, is inherently pleasurable. It speaks to our natural curiosity, our desire to make sense of the world.
So it's the intellectual satisfaction of recognition that makes it pleasurable.
Partly, yes. But he adds this caveat. He says if we've never encountered the thing being represented, we won't get that pleasure of recognition. But we might still enjoy the painting for other reasons, like the skill of the artist, the colors, and so on. So there are multiple layers to this pleasure.
Fascinating. So it's not just about mimicking reality, it's about how our minds engage with those representations on different levels.
Exactly. And then he makes this crucial point, that each genre aims for a particular kind of pleasure. Tragedy, through mimesis, aims for the pleasure derived from pity and fear. Comedy aims for the pleasure of amusement. They each have their own specific effect on the audience.
All right, let's focus on tragedy for a bit. What does Aristotle say makes a good tragedy?
Well, as we've talked about, the most effective tragedy is the one that best evokes those feelings of pity and fear. And he argues that the most important element is the plot, what he calls mythos.
So the story is key.
Absolutely. The plot drives the emotional response, and he gives all these guidelines for what makes a good plot. It needs to have unity, a clear beginning, middle, and end, a sense of wholeness. It should be universal, something that resonates with everyone, not just a specific time and place. It needs to be a manageable length, something people can grasp, and it has to be plausible, even if it includes coincidences or unexpected events.
Plausible. So even if it's fictional, it has to feel believable on some level.
Exactly. He even gives this example about a statue that accidentally fell on someone and killed them. That might seem like a random event, but a poet could weave it into a story in a way that makes it feel meaningful and even inevitable.
So it's about crafting the story in a way that pulls the audience in, makes them believe in the world you've created.
You got it. And remember that quote, poetry is more philosophical and more serious than history. That's where this idea of universality comes in.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. What did he mean by that?
He's basically saying that poetry, unlike history, focuses on the general, the cathalou, what's likely or necessary given a certain type of person and situation. So history tells us what actually happened, but poetry explores what could happen, what's humanly possible.
It gets at those deeper truths about human nature, what we're capable of, for better or worse.
Exactly. And within the plot, he identifies these key turning points: reversal of fortune, recognition, and suffering. These are the moments that really drive home those feelings of pity and fear.
And what about the characters themselves? What makes a good tragic character?
Well, first of all, they need to be believable. The audience has to be able to relate to them on some level. They're usually virtuous, so their downfall is tragic, not deserved, and they need to act in a way that's fitting for their character and their social standing.
So, no sudden bursts of philosophical wisdom from a simple farmer.
Probably not. And their language needs to be clear, but also powerful, using metaphors and figures of speech effectively.
Okay, so we've got the plot, the characters. Now we have to talk about that big, mysterious concept, catharsis. Why do we find pleasure in these seemingly negative emotions of pity and fear? That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah, catharsis is probably the most debated term in the entire poetics. Aristotle himself doesn't really define it clearly, which has led to endless interpretations over the centuries.
So what are some of the leading theories about what catharsis actually means?
Well, some people see it as a kind of emotional purging. You experience these intense emotions in the safe space of the theater, and it somehow cleanses you, releases those pent-up
Like
feelings.
an emotional detox.
Yeah, something like that. Others see it as a process of clarifying or refining those emotions. By experiencing them through mimesis, you understand them better, you become more aware of them.
So art helps us make sense of our own emotional landscape.
Exactly. And there are even those who connect catharsis to intellectual clarification. You witness the tragic events, and it leads to a deeper understanding of the human condition, the fragility of life, the consequences of our choices.
Wow, there's a lot packed into this one word. Did Aristotle himself offer any further clues about what he meant by catharsis?
He does mention it in the Politics, but in the context of music. He talks about how certain kinds of music can have a powerful effect on people who are prone to pity and fear, maybe even providing a kind of release or relief.
So music as therapy, basically.
Yeah, something like that. And this passage is often used to support the idea that catharsis in tragedy might involve a similar kind of emotional discharge.
But it's still not totally clear if he meant the same thing in both contexts.
Right. And some modern scholars actually take a more minimalist approach. They suggest that catharsis might simply refer to the release of tension that's built up during the play, or even just the physical act of expressing those emotions, crying, gasping, all that, which would have been pretty common in those ancient theaters.
I can imagine. So maybe it's not this big mystical purification, but a more grounded bodily experience.
Maybe. It's still up for debate,
Yeah.
and that's what makes it so fascinating. We're still grappling with these ideas thousands of years later.
Okay, but let's go back to pleasure for a second. How does mimesis actually transform these potentially painful emotions, pity and fear, into something enjoyable?
Well, one way to think about it is that in the theater, you're experiencing those emotions vicariously through the characters. It's a safe space. You're not actually in danger. You're not actually suffering
So
loss.
it's like a controlled experiment with our emotions.
In a way, yes. Aristotle even talks about this in Dionoma. He says imagining scary things is different from actually experiencing them. It's within our control. So tragedy allows us to explore these dark emotions, these anxieties, without the real-life consequences.
Makes sense. It's a way to process those feelings, to maybe even learn from them.
Right. And then there's the idea, which Plato also touched on, that tragic pleasure is a complex thing. It's a mix of the pain of witnessing suffering and the satisfaction of seeing a well-crafted story unfold, a story that makes sense, that resonates with our own experience.
So there's a beauty in the tragedy itself in the artistry that transcends the sadness.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it.
Okay, enough tragedy for now. Let's lighten things up a bit.
Yeah.
What about comedy? Did Aristotle take it seriously as an art form?
Oh, absolutely. He saw comedy as just as important as tragedy. After all, laughter is a fundamental part of the human experience. Just as tragedy aims for the specific pleasure of pity and fear, comedy aims for the pleasure of amusement.
So what's his take on what makes a good comedy?
He actually gives a pretty clear definition of the Poetics. He says comedy is a representation of people who are worse than average, but in a specific way. He focuses on their ridiculous flaws, the kind of errors that make us laugh but don't cause real harm or suffering.
So things slapstick, mistaken identities, those kinds of things.
Yeah, exactly. He even talks about the traditional comic mask, with its exaggerated features but no signs of actual pain. It's about laughing at someone, but not in a cruel or malicious way.
It's a playful kind of mockery.
Right. And while some theories of humor emphasize aggression or superiority, Aristotle's examples in the Poetics actually point to incongruity as a major source of comic pleasure.
Incongruity, like things not matching up the way we expect.
Exactly. The absurdity of a situation, the unexpected twist, that's what makes us laugh. But the important thing is that those comic blunders shouldn't lead to actual suffering.
Because then it wouldn't be funny anymore, just be tragic.
Precisely. And he also talks about different types of jokes in his lost book on comedy. The idea being that good comedy requires skillful use of humor, knowing how to craft a good joke. He even gives an example in the rhetoric of using a totally incongruous word, calling a fig tree August. It's that unexpected juxtaposition that creates the humor.
I see how that would be funny. But did he ever say what makes a comedy good beyond just being funny?
We don't have that full section of the Poetics, unfortunately, but there's a passage in the Nicomachean Ethics that gives us a clue. He talks about the difference between the kind of humor that appeals to educated people and the kind that appeals to the uneducated.
So there's a hierarchy of humor.
It seems so. He implies that good comedy, the kind that appeals to a sophisticated audience, is more subtle, relying on wit and innuendo rather than crude jokes.
Makes sense. Different types of humor for different audiences.
Right. Now, I know we've gone deep on mimesis, tragedy, comedy, catharsis, but there's one last question we need to tackle. What's the overall value of art for Aristotle? Why does it matter?
That's a huge question. It feels like we could spend a whole other episode on that.
You're not wrong.
Yeah.
But we can at least try to sketch out some of his ideas. Now, a lot of people have tried to find ethical justifications for art, often through interpretations of catharsis. But I think Aristotle's discussion of music and the politics offers a more direct and maybe even more interesting perspective.
Music. Really? Okay, how does that connect to the value of art?
Well, you see, in the politics, he kind of moves beyond Plato's view that music is primarily for moral education. He talks about music for leisure scholi in Greek and for intelligence phronesis. He's saying that music can be enjoyed for its own sake.
So not just as a tool for something else, but valuable in itself.
Exactly. And leisure, for Aristotle, isn't just about resting. It's about engaging in activities that are worthwhile for their own sake. And he sees that as a central part of living a good life.
So art, like music, can be one of those worthwhile activities we do for the sheer joy of it.
That's the idea. And the intelligence part. That likely refers to developing the capacity to be a good judge of music, to appreciate its qualities, to understand what makes it good.
So not just passively listening, but actively engaging with the music, developing a discerning ear.
Precisely. He even uses Homer as an example, suggesting that listening to poetry being performed is also a form of leisure. And he advocates for kids to learn music and drawing not just for practical reasons, but to cultivate their ability to appreciate beauty, to become good judges.
So art education isn't just about learning a skill, it's about developing our aesthetic sensibilities, our ability to truly see and understand beauty.
Exactly. He seems to be saying that the true value of art lies in its ability to give us this kind of intrinsic pleasure, to enrich our lives through that engagement. And he doesn't seem to be worried about art's political or religious functions. He's more interested in its power to move us, to make us think, to make us feel alive.
So even though he was writing over 2,000 years ago, his ideas still feel so relevant today.
Absolutely. And I think by grappling with those ancient perspectives, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the art we encounter in our own time.
Well said. And on that note, here's a final thought for you, dear listener. How would Aristotle's ideas apply to all the art forms we have today that he couldn't have even imagined? Movies, video games, virtual reality, the whole works. What kind of pleasure should we expect from these different media? And how can we become better judges of their quality, develop a more discerning eye, a more sensitive ear? It's something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this philosophical journey.